Welcome back, everyone, to CPG's Supply Chain of Thought podcast. I'm here again with CPG's CEO and founder, Michael De Clercq. He is a veteran in global sourcing since 1978. Welcome back, Michael.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, everybody.
So today we are delving into a foundational topic. We are going to be discussing the difference between resilience and agility in supply chains. Since I started at CPG back in 2018, the word on everyone's mind was resilience. Everyone was talking about resilience. But in recent years, it seems that agility is gaining more traction as being, if not as important, sometimes more important or equally important. So that is what we're going to be talking about today, the difference between resilience and agility.
This topic has been coming up a lot lately, right, in our conversations with our clients, and that's because things are so uncertain. So there's a huge focus on supply chain management, something that people used to take for granted. Supply chain used to work very smoothly, and it was just a matter of optimizing it. Now it's more of an existential threat, and everyone wants to future-proof their supply chain, but it's very hard to do, with the current level of unpredictability. And we spoke about that in the past, unpredictability months ago, and it's just as bad as before. So the real question is, when you think about that, resilience versus agility has to really do with, are you preparing to absorb shocks, or are you planning to move faster than the shock itself?
Right. Right. That is the billion-dollar question. And, I have heard it time and time again because, CPG, we attend these supply chain events to really understand the word on the street, to speak with companies, to hear about their troubles and challenges and successes. And most recently at Change, this Change event in Brussels, which was really about, it was marketed as sustainability in supply chains, but this was the focus of conversation. It was interesting for me, Michael, because you and I had been talking about agility quite a bit over the past year, I guess, ever since we started this podcast. We kind of end the podcast by saying, stay agile. But many companies were still focused on resilience up until very recently, and then finding themselves stuck because things are changing so fast right now with this new administration that you really need agility to stay ahead.
For sure.
So before we dive in, just wanted to share with listeners again that we are going to structure this podcast as we normally do. We use this IDS format, which means identify, discuss, solve. So we will be going through the differences between resilience and agility, and specifically within the supply chain context. Then we're going to be discussing in more detail the traits and the strategies and the tools for each approach. And Michael will share some China sourcing specific examples and Asia sourcing examples, along with the importance of both strategies. So as I said in the beginning, it's you need both. You can't have one without the other. But I think depending on what's happening in the world, sometimes you might need to focus more on one than the other. And then the last section, we're going to be focusing on some solves, so some potential solutions. Michael's going to be sharing how companies can build agility without losing resilience, in the current environment. Sound good?
Sounds very good.
All right. So first, this definition part, I'm going to go through what I understand as the definitions of resilience and agility, Michael, and then I'd love you to flesh it out and put some more meat on those bones. So resilience, the ability to survive a disruption is what I understand. To get back on track, I understand it to be more focused on risk mitigation, a defensive mindset, recovering from shocks. And I think that, again, this has been the focus in the past, 5 years or so. But more recently, it seems that companies are focusing on agility. And I understand agility to be the ability to adapt to change. It's faster tempo. It's more offensive mindset. It's the ability to use data and real-time data to turn a disruption into really an advantage.
Yeah, I mean, these two terms are used a lot, and it's good that you're defining them, Laura. Resilience is about, I guess, being tough, bulletproof if you want. If you're going to use a sports metaphor to describe both, you could say that resilience is like having a strong defense, in football. Massive guys that keep you in the game no matter how hard you get hit.
Right.
Whereas agility is more like having an offense that can change the plays instantly and score before the other side even reacts or adjusts to your new tactics.
It's a helpful analogy. I think a lot of listeners can relate to that, and that will help them understand. So let's go a bit deeper in this discuss section and talk about the application to supply chain. So resilience is survival, defensive, recovering some from shocks. What are some examples in the supply chain of using a resilient approach or having a resilient strategy?
Okay, so think again in supply chain terms, your objective is to ensure that your supply of product comes through no matter what, right? That's the essence of a resilient supply chain. When you're confronted by challenges that affect the ability of your supply chain to predictably deliver all the time, you are, forced to take steps to try and, get around that or prevent that from impacting your business, trying to ensure, in other words, that your products will come no matter what. And so in sourcing, a typical approach would be to have multiple sources to produce the same item. So if your business is dependent on one key item, instead of making it all in one factory, you're making it in multiple factories if you can, and ideally also in different countries. So not just multiple factories in China, say, but one or two factories in China might be a way to do it, plus another factory in Vietnam and maybe one in Mexico if indeed the product fits for that.
Got it. So, like you said, a steady stream of that same product, and to ensure that you need to have it produced in multiple locations.
Correct.
Okay. In addition to that, dual sourcing, what are some other tools?
Well, so another way to make sure that your supply chain is resilient, and again, think in terms of an importer who will not want to interrupt the flow of his product. One way to do that is to keep a significant amount of inventory, more than necessary. And this is what some people call the just in case approach.
So, having buffer stock, that can be a bit expensive from what I hear. You're paying for extra inventory and you're paying for storage, but it helps in a crisis. I think it would have come in handy. I know it did come in handy this year in about May timeframe when tariffs on goods from China were about, over 155% in many instances.
Well, I mean, you make a good point, but quick comments. This year was also an issue of cost, right? So people quickly accelerated or their deliveries or got more of them because they anticipated tariffs was going to increase their cost.
Right.
But putting aside that tariff issue, a resilient supply chain, their concern is that there is an interruption of supply. In this case, it's, if you remember, they were talking about 145% tariffs. That would have been equivalent to an interruption of supply because, it would have been so expensive.
Absolutely, yeah.
So people, got merchandise in that gave them resiliency. Sometimes they're air freighted in, the merchandise in. But you also make a very good point about costs. One of the traits, Laura, of resiliency is that it's expensive. Think of another way of thinking it is take a car, right? A normal car, if somebody shoots at it, you're going to have broken windows and people inside are going to be at risk. But if you bulletproof your car, you're adding resiliency to that car. It's, It's bulletproof now. People can shoot at it, but people inside will be safe. Guess what? A bulletproof car is more expensive than a normal car.
Yeah.
And that's always true in resiliency. Nearly every single tactic that you use to increase resiliency will increase your cost, including, what I mentioned about having multiple sources, especially multiple sources in different countries.
Right. Right. Okay. So far you've covered dual sourcing and also safety stock. Any other tools, resilient tools for the modern day importer?
Well, there's two more. One, I mean, there's many more, but the big ones, right? We're looking at the main tools, and one of them is comprehensive long-term contracts. That tends to increase a guaranteed supply. And these long-term contracts might involve, for example, depending on the product, you might own your own set of molds if you're making something that requires molds. So even if you don't control the factory itself, because it's not your own factory, it's a third party factory, but you own your molds, and that adds to your resiliency if you want. It adds to your control. And finally, the other element is about resiliency is data. And so here, what you're doing is you're investing in in-depth analysis of market trends in terms of, how much inventory you need, where are we going with this, and also supply chain trends. For example, if you're using copper, is the price of copper going to go up, and so you're dealing with that, and you're trying to stay ahead also, as we spoke about 2 minutes ago, of geopolitical trends, such as the avoidance of tariffs.
Interesting, this data piece, and I think you might talk about it a bit more when we talk about agility. But in my mind, I think of having this data, I think it's also kind of an agile approach as well. And perhaps you can help distinguish how different types of data might be considered a resilient or agile approach. I think of it as a way, you have the data, so therefore you can respond to that information.
Well, that's right. And look, knowledge is power, right?
Right.
And data is what gives us knowledge. And the power that you get from knowledge is going to be used differently if your main objective is resiliency
Right.
versus agility. But we can talk about it when we get to it.
So the main resilient approaches that we've highlighted here, that you've highlighted: dual sourcing, safety stock, buffer stock just in case, comprehensive long-term contracts that guarantee supply and give you control over your molds, for example, more control, and then data on supply chain trends, geopolitical trends, where you can secure the lowest cost. That is helpful. Okay, so how about agile or agility tools?
Okay, so agility we spoke about, right? It means moving fast, ideally moving ahead of your competition. And so here, the tools that you tend to use in agility they would include, let's put it this way, they would include the following. One of them would be frequent benchmarking. If you're buying from a well-known supplier or from a proven supplier, there is a tendency to be a little bit lazy and not to necessarily check what other suppliers are doing because you're comfortable. But an agile buyer will benchmark the product with other suppliers and other countries as well, partially to stay ahead of the curve and partially to keep their existing supplier, on the ball in terms of quality and pricing. Another one is, we spoke about just in case inventory. Agility is just in time inventory. So here the idea, everything about supply chain is related to money, right? To basically your profitability as a business. And so just in time inventory means that you get merchandise when you need it and you don't overload your warehouses and pay warehouse fees and things like that with merchandise. And it's a very important concept, just in time inventory, because it's actually difficult to do.
Yeah, I think it would
Uh,
require so much management, excellent management, communication, all that.
Well, that's right. And it requires good management all the way through your supply chain.
Right.
It's, in other words, most people will hate to have a situation where they got more orders than they've got inventory, because all these orders that they cannot fill is money that they're losing. So they tend to, if you want, stray towards more inventory than orders with the hope that they can sell. And that's just a way to go. But if you do just in time inventory, you're anticipating where the market is going. You also have flexibility in the speed of delivery of your orders. You control the shipping very tightly. It's a skill, but this kind of agility can be very profitable.
Interesting. I have more comments on this, but I want to let you go through the other tools if you have them regarding agility. So just in time,
Well, yeah, just in time.
benchmarking.
Yeah, and then another one is, okay, it's a management attitude, the willingness to switch big orders to best suppliers. Again, it sounds fairly pedestrian, but a lot of people are not willing to do this. And so their vendors recognize, and they tend to interpret this as, they're indispensable. And, if the vendor is reasonably intelligent, they're going to, increase their price a little bit. So your competitive angle is affected by that lack of willingness. So again, willingness to switch big orders to best suppliers. And keep in mind, willingness doesn't mean you're going to do it. It just means you're willing to do it. And then your vendors are going to be, again, they're going to be kept on their toes. These guys, if I don't deliver, they're going to give these orders to my competitors. So you tend to get the best results from your vendors that way. There's also a willingness to try different methods, new methods to get the product to market. One example, Laura, is that de minimis rule, which was used very effectively by Chinese companies like Shine, for example,
Mm-hmm.
fast fashion companies.
Mm-hmm.
But interestingly enough, was not used very much by US companies, even though this is for the US market.
Right.
And of course, now that de minimis rule, I'm illustrating with it. It's been eliminated at this point. I don't know if it's going to stay eliminated, but that's what it is now.
Right.
But it's a good example of agility to be able to use that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, willingness to test new suppliers in different countries. Don't assume that you necessarily have the best deal. And this is also related to my frequent benchmarking point. Another element is close monitoring of competitors and willing to question your assumptions.
Yeah.
So what are your competitors doing? If you see an equivalent product going to market for a cheaper price, you've got to be on top of that.
Right.
And finally, you're back to data, right? Which is what we spoke about a few minutes ago. And this is in-depth analysis of various trends to avoid surprises on the one hand and anticipate changes.
Mm-hmm.
So again, you're agile, you got to stay ahead of the ball, ahead of the game, and what gives you that agility tends to be knowledge. And that knowledge then is what you obtain through both data collection and data analysis.
Excellent. Lots of tools there. So to summarize, we have flexible contracts instead of sort of long-term contracts that give you lots of control, more flexible that allow you to shift orders quickly, just in time inventory, which could be kind of a scary thing. You need to be willing to do it. Also, on this whole willingness point, you have to be willing to adapt and try new strategies, new suppliers. And I think this whole point is really related to a supplier ecosystem, having different suppliers and different locations that can pivot on a very short notice. And also data and analysis, but it's I think different kind of data. So you mentioned regarding resilience tools, data that, shows you trends. Here we're talking about more actionable, sort of short-term actionable data, such as price benchmarking data. So you can pivot, what your competitors are doing quite quickly. And you can source various components from different suppliers and switch on a dime. Are we on the same page?
Want expert insight on your supply chain? Schedule a free consultation with CPG Sourcing. CPG partners with companies across all industries importing from China. With over 46 years of sourcing expertise and a dedicated team on the ground, we help you secure high-quality products at the best price delivered on time. Visit cpgsourcing.com/book a call to see how we can strengthen your supply chain for resilience and sustainability. Mention Supply Chain of Thought when you reach out to receive 10 extra resource hours in your first month. That's cpgsourcing.com/book a call.
Yeah. I mean, again, data, if we think about it, Laura, is involved in nearly everything that we spoke
Right.
about. Frequent benchmarking, what's that? That's data
Yes.
acquisition,
Yes.
right? The points that I made about willingness are different because it's really a management attitude. And if you don't have that kind of attitude, then you're simply not agile. But again, that attitude is informed by data.
Yeah, helpful
Yeah,
clarification. I think
yeah.
what I was going to say about this willingness piece, and this is the first time I really thought of it in this way, but I think it is similar. It's related to your sports analogy. I think of a resilient approach. You're more defensive. It's more of a fearful approach. You're protecting yourself against something. And I think of agility, a more offensive approach, is being really less fearful. So this willingness means that you are willing to take the risks, you're willing to try new things, to adapt. And I think to have that willingness and to be less fearful, you need to have trust in your systems, trust in your data, trust in your people. And so it really is a whole different sort of paradigm shift, a mindset shift. And to be able to make that mindset shift, you need the support to do so. You're not going to do so without having the people to support these rapid shifts, without having the data, without having the suppliers set up in advance. So it sounds like an excellent approach that requires some investment, time and effort to establish these different solutions.
You make very good points. And keep in mind, Laura, what's interesting is that, if people understand, the difference between resiliency and agility, and they want to put to work these concepts, but they don't have the management mindset. They won't be able to do it. You have to be, if you're going to be agile, you have to be willing to take some risks. That means acting fast. Whereas if your main focus is to be resilient, to a certain extent, you're very risk adverse. It's sort of pretty much the opposite
Right.
of agility.
Right. So in the China context, I think both are important, of course, resilience and agility. But in your mind, where does China excel if you're going to look at the China supply chain? Is it in either or, resilience or
What do
agility?
you in the China context?
Yes.
I mean, again, I find China's an interesting equation all the time because there's a fair amount of bad press about China as a supplier, and yet China is still today the biggest exporter of manufactured goods in the world by far. And obviously, there's a reason for that. You know, it's the old concept. You can't sell if people don't buy, and if people buy so much of that stuff that comes out of China, it must mean it's good. Otherwise, you know, why would they buy it? And so here we have this, geopolitical challenge where China is subject to things that importers can't easily control, which are tariffs. And so in the context of China, how does resiliency work? It's been an interesting ride to watch how that plays because initially, if you recall, when we were talking earlier part of the year, 145% tariffs, I mean, that pretty much would have shut China down, except it didn't happen. And the other thing was even if China was held at the level of, say, 35 or 50% tariffs, which are huge, right? That would have seriously hampered, China merchandise from entering the United States. But instead, what happened is that the geopolitical dynamics were that all Chinese competitors also got hit by lots of tariffs. And that was very much unpredictable, I think. And so China remained a viable source all through this time, partially because of its ability to negotiate. China is the only, I think, country that, uh, you know, energetically pushed back against U.S. tariffs, and to this day, as you know, they were just given an extension of 90 days. The status quo has been fairly well maintained, and there's a reason for that. China is very robust. But what am I doing when I talk about this? I'm evaluating geopolitical risk. That's what importers have to be doing when they're talking about China. That's sort of the big picture part, Laura. I'm pretty sure that's not what you were asking me
Well,
to address, but
well, I was thinking about China, and of course China and the rest of the world, right? And so I think China excels at both resilience and agility. So you think of resilience, dual sourcing, let's just say dual sourcing, for example. In China, of course, you have the ability to do that. You have these glasses you can pick from 1,000 suppliers, if not more, to produce the exact same thing. And you can probably do something similar in Vietnam or another country. But really, the point that I was getting at.
wait. You can do something similar to these thousands of Chinese factories, but you will not find thousands of Vietnamese factories making them.
No, but I'm saying my point is that you can, I think, achieve resilience in other places. You can have
Yeah.
dual sources, say, for example, you're right, not thousands of suppliers, but you can have dual sources, I think, in Vietnam, India, Bangladesh. The point that I was trying to make is that I think that in terms of agility, China is very competitive. It's hard to beat, with its ability to adapt quickly on a dime, and we've seen this time and time again. COVID was really one of the first times where you saw these manufacturers quickly switch from manufacturing one thing to the other. And then also, as these environmental regulations change throughout the world and sustainability becomes a focus of countries and people everywhere, the ability to switch out materials used in these different products and that sort of thing. So I guess what I'm saying is China delivers both, but I don't think there's another country right now that can even remotely compete with the agility of China because of the scale, depth of its supply chain, nimbleness.
Yeah. And nimbleness, Laura,
Sort of
is
an awkward word, but
no, it's a good word. But if you think, why are they nimble, right? The answer is Chinese suppliers, as you said 2 minutes ago, there's a lot of them. There's literally thousands. And they're very, very competitive, right? So they compete against each other all the time. And you go to a Chinese supplier and you say, "Can you do this for me?" The chances are they'll say yes before they even understand what it is that you want to do, because they're eager and because they're clever, they're inventive, and they have access to all these sub suppliers,
right,
which gives them a very quick turnaround in terms of, yep, I need this little tidbit in order to
right,
make this thing work. I can get it done. And that gives China a very difficult. It makes China a very difficult place to beat as an environment for sourcing. And the only way you can really beat it is with, again, geopolitical threats like tariffs and
right.
things like that.
Right. And the subcontractor point, or sometimes they're called tier 2, 3 suppliers, topic for another conversation. It gives you the ability to adapt quickly. It also means that transparency and management on the ground is very, very important to just sort of manage those tiers of suppliers. But that's this topic for another day.
But you're right.
Yeah.
And what it also points to is another thing that maybe some people are not aware of is sometimes you place an order with a Chinese supplier and you think they're the ones who are going to manufacture it. But depending on what the product is, they may very well subcontract it to somebody else.
Happens all the time.
And again, knowledge of this, awareness of this is what helps you stay ahead of the pack, as it were.
Right. So, Michael, in preparing for this discussion, you said that you felt in modern supply chains that agility is often preferred over resilience. Speed matters more than static protection. And you also have mentioned multiple times that it's cheaper, as in agility is cheaper. And you use that example of the car, bulletproof car. So good resilience is expensive. Furthermore, and I think this is the most difficult part for a lot of listeners, that agility is a part of resilience, a piece of resilience. And so there is some overlap, or that it's a component of being resilient. So I was hoping you could go through some specific examples of resilience and agility using sourcing in China context, some examples that you have from your experience of resilience and agility.
Thinking of switching suppliers? Let us review your options. We offer free benchmarking for all our podcast listeners. With a network of thousands of suppliers, why not see if you can get a better quality product at a lower price? Go to cpgsourcing.com/book a call to see how you can optimize your supply chain today. That's cpgsourcing.com/book a call.
So you make a good point. The interesting thing is we start off by saying, in effect, what's better, resiliency or agility? And in a way, you could say that it's always a matter of degree. What's optimal for a supply chain is to be reasonably resilient. And what makes you resilient ideally should be a certain amount of agility. And yes, there is a tendency to gravitate towards more agility. I think partially because if you have done a reasonably good job in setting up your supply chain, in doing so, you've created a sufficient amount of resiliency already. So what you're going to be focusing more on is agility, because agility is, think of building the foundation of a house. Once you've built it, you can build your house on it. You don't need to go back and think, shall I improve the foundation? Generally speaking, you don't do that. And in a supply chain, when you set up your supply chain, you would ideally set it up in a way that is quite resilient. That's an element of, if you want future proofing, is what some people say. Prevention is better than cure, so you think of writing a contract for a supplier to purchase something. You're going to put clauses in there that seem unlikely, but at least you're covering all the bases. And that's what, in a way, resiliency is. But as you are in the process of buying product over time, you want to stay very agile. You want to be agile and you want to stay agile. That's where that emphasis, I think, belongs. Does that sort of clarify a bit?
It does, yes. And you've been doing this for many decades now. Do any specific examples come to mind, past clients that you could use to highlight the difference between these two concepts, or the overlapping, or their integration?
When you think about successful companies that import product, right? And you focus on what they're doing, you will rapidly see some of these case studies coming to life. We saw them, as you pointed out. We've done this for nearly 50 years now. In the early days, we would see these very successful companies that were primarily buying from South Korea and Taiwan. They would dip their toes into China. And in those days, China was considered to be incredibly risky because it was unproven. You didn't know what the quality was going to be like. Also, deliveries were terrible, but they did it. And that's an example of agility. if you look for resilience and fast forward a few years, the same types of companies would place very big orders in China because China gave them this low cost promise. You know, the first cost was very low in China in those days. But they kept placing orders with their old suppliers in South Korea and Taiwan as well. So they had this same product at two different price points, but they had a continuity of supply no matter what. If the risky Chinese suppliers that were very cheap didn't come through, it was all right. They still had their supplies from the proven suppliers. That's an example again of resilience. Again, you see this at work a lot. We've got an interesting example would be this Chinese company that made electronic products in China. All of it was in China, and they saw these tariffs coming, and they thought, "Wow, what are we going to do?" And one of the thoughts was, "Let's do a bit like Apple. You know, we're going to open up production in India." You know, that's an interesting idea. It's an agile idea because you can tap into the Indian low-cost workforce and also their access to technology and electronics. You might still use some Chinese electronic components, but that's okay. It can be done. And then you have the potential bonus, potentially, of selling to the Indian market, which, you know, is a huge potential market. You know, that's an example of agility. But as it turned out for those people, they were not Apple. And guess what happened to India? You know, they got hit with 50% tariffs. So even though it was a good idea, and it frankly looked very low risk because the relationships at the time, the geopolitical relationships between India and America were very good. But as we know, these relationships are unstable, and those
Right.
guys got, you know, they got hit by that. So there's an example of good idea, very agile. As it turned out, it didn't work out. Now, there's also examples similar to that where it did work out. We have this large customer who buys chemicals, a lot of chemicals from China. Years ago, they started to look for alternative sources in unlikely places like Africa. And they developed these, took a bit of time, and they ended up with, you know, reliable sources there as well, which at the beginning supplemented their Chinese supply and eventually also acted as a fallback, plan B kind of, if China was going to, be a problem in terms of tariffs. So you have that situation. Another example, we talked about data. One of our industrial clients found out they were losing orders, and these were big orders, you know, tens of millions of dollars, to their competition, and they didn't understand why, but they managed to find out. They obtained data, and the data was that, to their surprise, the people that won the orders were companies that source a significant amount of these industrial products from China. And those people thought, well, China is not the flavor of the month. Well, how come? You know, how come people agree to buy it? But the answer is China was 15-20% cheaper. That's how come. And so they quickly switched, learning that information. They used that information to make a rapid switch to China and ended up becoming competitive again. You know, and you have an example of benchmarking. You know, we had a European client in fasteners, which is a notoriously low margin product, and they had been in China buying stuff for 20 years. And they thought they knew everything, but they did very little benchmarking. They were, again, comfortable with their existing suppliers. We challenged, if you want, that status quo mindset with them. They were very skeptical that they thought they knew all of the main suppliers. They thought they knew the pricing, and they thought that nobody could buy better than they could themselves. Lo and behold, we found savings of up to 25% on some of their products. They were floored by this. Again, we're talking about a low margin product, you know. So again,
Yeah.
agility pays.
Right. So These are really interesting examples, and I'm here thinking about the differences in the two because, of course, as you said, agility is a piece of resilience. And I also think that, and you might disagree with me, but I think that 20 years ago, sourcing from China instead of Korea or Taiwan might have seemed like a new thing, more of an agile response. But then once something becomes routine, I almost think it moves from being agile to a resilient approach when something becomes more routine. And I guess in my mind, I think of it, a good distinction for me is resilience defensive approach is kind of comfortable, you're defensive, but in this routine system. And agility is being, never too comfortable with your existing structure and always exploring different options and sort of testing out different strategies. So again, using the sports analogy, you're comfortable in knowing that your defense is going to protect you to some extent, but an offensive approach is really just being aggressive, getting out there. So, and then I also think about, in the supply chain, there's been discussion recently about, a resilient approach. Of course, you want resilience. Again, this has been the buzzword for years now, but in a way, it does provide a false sense of security. And what I mean is, say you order a bunch of materials or a bunch of products because of you're afraid of tariffs or you're afraid of freight prices increasing, and then all of a sudden something changes, whether the product goes out of style or a material in the product is banned, and then all of a sudden you're stuck with all this stock, all this inventory that you can't use. So it's it can be a false sense of security.
And that's why you have such a thriving industry in America of closeouts, where there are people who will buy your inventory for 5 cents on the dollar, and you'll be happy to sell it to them because
Right.
you can't do anything with it. And it's also one of the reasons why dollar stores are thriving, and why America is the greatest consumer paradise, because if you search for it, you can get very good value for consumer products. But again, your point about China, what's interesting is China encompasses all of the elements of resiliency and agility. Because, as you said, in the early days, it was more of an agile move to go to China. It was risky. You had to move fast. You have to be, ideally first there. In the early days, you could secure amazing deals, not just in low first cost, but also in terms of exclusivity. We had clients that were buying waders. Are you familiar with waders?
I am now, because you've explained them in the past, but I don't think a listener
So
would be
waders
familiar
are,
with them.
waders are boots that go up to your chest, in
Yeah.
effect. They're basically pants, waterproof, rubberized pants attached to boots. Some go up to the top of your legs, and some go up all the way to your chest. And it's a product that fishermen, fly fishermen use, that type of thing. And there's a fairly big market in the US, especially in the United States, for this. And this client of ours, who was a major mover of these products, started to make them in China, and China never made this before. So they made it with this one factory in Guangdong province, and they secured an exclusivity from them. And for 2 years, the exclusivity didn't last forever, but for 2 years, they dominated this market. They bought hundreds of thousands of pairs of really good quality waders at very low prices. And their competitors couldn't do anything about it. They eventually found out which factory made them, but there was an exclusivity, so they couldn't get access to it. It was an interesting example of agility. But then, as you said, you move into this resiliency. You want to be resilient, you ought to buy from China. So China, fast forward a few years, becomes the place to be. It's no longer an adventure. It's no longer crazy stuff. It's become the norm. So now you got to be there.
Right.
If you're going to be resilient, you have to be there. It's no longer exotic. It's there. However, while all this is happening, you have the geopolitical forces, so in the early days, China, had tariffs. You had this thing called most favored nation, where every year the US government had to review whether they would give China, you know, most favored nation status and all of that. And then eventually, of course, China entered, the WTO, World Trade Organization, and things started to stabilize. And that's really where resiliency kind of became sort of the norm for China. And then you had, the Trump administration. We threw threw everything out of the window again, and you're back into this geopolitical maelstrom, and where you have to keep all of these factors in mind when you develop both your strategy and your tactics in order to be the guys that have the optimal supply chain.
Right.
Because again, resiliency, agility, equal sign, optimal supply chain. How do you make that formula work?
Before we kind of close out, because I think we've covered most of the topics here, I did want to just add something else that occurred to me when you're speaking about this, because we do need both. You need resilience and agility, and there's some overlap, and sometimes agility becomes resilience, but too much of either is bad. Too much resilience is expensive, reduces your competitive advantage sometimes. Too much agility can also be expensive. Keep in mind that having these a supplier ecosystem and doing the benchmarking and having the management structure in place can also be expensive. But in our experience, every single time, it's a worthy investment, because you are how to explain it. You're still in the game when your competitors might be in the dust. They can't adapt quickly enough. Something else that also just occurred to me is that, and perhaps this is one of the reasons why agility is becoming more and more important, is I think, your comments about closeouts in the United States made me think of all this waste. And as our world moves towards sustainability, I think people don't want to have these mass warehouses of cheap goods that are produced in excess and then sold for pennies. You do want something, I think, that is a bit more responsive to demand, while not being fast fashion that is just created and then destroyed in a day. So it's all about balance, isn't it?
It is. To a certain extent, Laura, it's a philosophy of life, right? If you take resiliency to an extreme, it's going to be bad for you. And if you take agility to an extreme, it's also going to be bad for you. But to understand it, again, resiliency is the foundation. That should be the foundation of your supply chain. You should be willing to do a lot of agility, with the key component that you got to keep in mind is that you don't want to destroy your foundation.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as you hold that line, you can be extremely agile. And generally speaking, that agility will pay for you. But you got to maintain that foundation. And so, again, using China as an example, a lot of people manufacture stuff in China, and then they can see the geopolitical clouds on the horizon, and they're thinking, whoa, we got to get out of China. How many of those serious, successful companies do you know that packed their bags overnight and left, which would have been very agile, right? But would have been also very stupid, because as it turned out, those geopolitical clouds turned out to be not what you thought they were. And so what all of these people, practically all the successful companies did, they moved a little bit out of China just to test the waters, but they kept the bulk of what they were doing in China no matter what, because that was the predictable power play.
Right.
And that's what gave them resiliency.
Right.
They were ready to jump, if you want, if pushed.
Right.
But they didn't jump. They held on to that solid base, if you will.
Enjoying the podcast? Follow us on LinkedIn at CPG Sourcing for more expert insights. Got a sourcing question? Drop us a message on LinkedIn and we might answer it on the show. That's linkedin.com/company/CPG Sourcing.
So let's use that example. holding on to the base while being agile, the base being the foundation and the resiliency. To segue into the solve, you had mentioned that you had 3 things that you think that companies can do to help them build agility without losing resilience, some 3 practical steps. And so I'd love to hear them. I'm sure everybody wants to hear them.
I think the 3 things would be shorten decision loops, build modular supply relationships, and run what if drills, right? And again, a lot of that is based on data, right? So think about shortened decision loops. Here, if you're going to make decisions, you're going to make decisions based on data. So you need to invest into real-time data visibility across your supply chain. Again, depending on how sensitive your supply chain is to price changes, you would want to know in real time if there are fluctuations in raw material prices. For example, in Guangdong on Monday, your sourcing team should know Tuesday and be able to act on Wednesday.
Excellent point. And to have that data, you need people. You mentioned sourcing team. You can't remove that sourcing team point or the people point, to verify that data on the ground. In China, sometimes data transparency is an issue. So having the team to provide that information is really important there. Okay, so go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's interesting that you say that, because another big looming factor that affects the supply chain is AI, right? And so in the States, what does AI do? I mean, AI is a tool to crunch data, right? You don't really need people to do that, right? Because you got all that data.
Assuming the
data's in China,
assuming the data's good.
China, in China, you don't have the data. Or if you do have it, it's most likely unreliable. And China's got this interesting situation where you have this great firewall of China in terms of the internet, so that if you're outside of China, it's difficult to look in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you need, as you said, people on the ground to validate, make sure that your data is correct. And those people have to be on the ground in China in order for that to work for you.
Absolutely. And you're bringing up real-time examples right now. I mean, these are things that, conversations we are having with our Beijing team right now, this week, yesterday. This is the data I'm finding based on my research here in the United States. What are you finding based on your research? And so we compare and contrast together with what we find, and it's a really helpful exchange. And between the 2 teams, we can come up with sort of the best, most accurate data, but it really takes that, synergy. All right. So you mentioned supplier ecosystems and modular supplier relationships. Can you go into that a bit more, explain that in a bit more detail?
Yeah, what I meant by build modular supplier relationships, what you call the supplier ecosystems, is it has to do with, again, agility, because if you're lazy, you're going to look for one factory that's going to make as many of your SKUs as possible. But if you're agile, you're going to find the best supplier, optimal supplier in terms of production speed, quality, reliability, etc., for that one product. And then that means you're going to find another supplier for another product. And the ability to develop this network of related factories is what makes you a winner, if you want, in terms of sourcing in an optimal fashion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that we do that quite a bit with our clients, actually, and it's somewhat different topic, but when you talk about these modular supplier relationships, we use that for agility, but also for things such as IP. If you don't want one manufacturer or one supplier to have your whole product assembled, that's where another example of when these modular relationships come in, where you're working with one supplier for one piece and another for another, and you can really substitute and exchange and switch out different components and different materials. But
not only that, Laura, but again, a lot of people, they when they go into China, they find one good supplier, and they say, wow, these guys are great. They speak English. They pretty much tell me what I want to hear. They make a good product. I saw a good sample. I'm going to give them a whole bunch of SKUs,
Right.
right? Including SKUs that, frankly, those guys don't make. Now, do you think that supplier is going to say no?
Of course
They're
not.
not going to say
No.
no. They'll take all your orders. But then what happens, because you don't go deep, you don't go in depth, you don't search for the data, you don't discover that half of your products are actually being subcontracted to those factories that are specialists in that particular
Right.
SKU, if
Right.
you know what I mean.
Yep.
And so you didn't invest in that benchmarking, into that research, into that data acquisition. You end up buying at a higher first cost than you should have.
Absolutely.
And you also expose yourself potentially to quality control risks as well as delivery risks. So here, the data helps you be agile, and the sort of the desire to be resilient and rely on a rock solid one supplier is actually a false form of peace of mind.
Yes. Yep. So the modularity in those relationships is key. And again, I can think of so many examples of when that specific case where you think your one supplier is doing everything, and then you find out that they're not, and so you're paying higher prices, and then your goods are not being, within conformity or within your expectations. So it can open up a whole can of worms. And so I think that kind of is a good segue to your last point. You had mentioned run what if drills. And so those were a couple examples. What if my supplier subcontracts, I don't have control? What else do you mean by these what if drills?
Okay, so what if drills are, again, this is management. It's a management technique, and it's primarily an agility element, right? So say once a quarter, you simulate, for example, a sudden disruption. Your primary supplier just shut down. What's the next move? Or tariffs on that particular country went up into the stratosphere. What are you going to do about it? It's a difficult exercise to run for people who are not used to it, but it's incredibly useful because it forces you to think outside of the envelope. These techniques are not new, Laura.
Right.
There is, you're familiar with, SWOT analysis, strength, weakness, opportunity, threat analyses that good companies run. They're very important. It's, for example, if you say, well, back to that client who buys all of their electronic products from China, they're potentially facing an existential threat if China gets, tariffed out at ridiculous levels. So what they would do with that, they might take an initiative and start investing into a deep down analysis of what the same product would cost if it was sourced in India, in Vietnam, and in Mexico, for example. They may not want to buy it yet, but they want to be ready. And when I mean in depth, I don't mean like, oh yeah, Joe Schmo makes this in Vietnam. When the time comes, I can talk to him. No, you're talking about samples, in depth, ready to place an order type. And here's an example where agility costs money, and you might not actually use it, but which also points to your earlier point about resiliency, because if you don't have to use it, you're going to stick to your known and existing suppliers, which are most likely cheaper anyway. But if the problem becomes uncontrollable, guess what? You got plan B, you got plan C, you might even have plan D.
Mm-hmm.
That's how agile you are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it's a really great, lesson for business, this whole last point about what if drills. And I think this whole lesson about resilience and agility. Again, I see a resilience as more of a defensive approach. You might be fearful. And I see agility as being willing to face the challenges, ask the hard questions, run the SWOT analyses, take the risks, but it's an aggressive, responsive approach. And so you do need both. I have been, I think, working in on China issues for about 20 years now, and we used to have a motto, steadfast in the storm, which I think is a resilience. That speaks to resiliency, and agility is more about, just having fun, dancing, making the most of the storm. It's more like 乘风破浪, which is
Yeah.
brave the wind and the waves, which is a Chinese idiom about using challenges to propel yourself forward.
Yeah. No, I like your metaphor, steadfast in the storm and laughing and dancing in the rain, and I think that's a very good way to describe it. And it's also a good way to picture how those two things work together, because you can be steadfast in the storm and also dance in the rain, right?
True. It's true. And so really having that hybrid approach, I think, is key. And I think that's a good way to close today. Thank you all for tuning in to CPG's Supply Chain of Thought. And stay tuned until next time. I don't have a topic top of mind, but there's many interesting things we could cover in the future. And I look forward to our next discussion, Michael. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Nice talking with you, Laura.
You.
And I hope everybody stays both agile and resilient.
Great. Yes. Likewise. Thank you.
Shout out to our friends at Kick Further, the best way to get funding for 100% of your inventory without taking on debt or giving up equity. Kick Further puts you in control of your business. Eliminate stockouts, keep up with demand, and move into growth mode. Visit kickfurther.com today.